be a little bit of a change of pace. If the previous talk was the least specialist, this is going to be probably the most specialist one. And I feel like I haven't done a lot of public speaking in the last couple of years. So if I go way fast, like 100 miles per hour, and I stop breathing, essentially, and I start looking like Chippy over there, then please stop me, somebody. I'm quite nervous. This feels like a huge thing. So yeah, my name is Bianca. I am a type designer. I used to be a type designer, and I am a font technologist, and I'm employed as a staff typographer at Spotify. And within Spotify, I am embedded in the team that is responsible for our design system over there. The design system is called Encore. As a typographer working on design systems for an audio streaming provider, you ask yourself the really big questions like this one. This is actually my favorite comment when we launched Spotify Mix, which is our custom font in spring. Reddit went wild, obviously. Turns out your average Joe is not really all that into the benefits of typographic changes. So we got a lot of sarcastic comments like this one. But I actually thought this question is spot on, and I should make this my mantra, especially since I'm working for Spotify. If you haven't met many typographers working on design systems, that's because we are a bit of a rare breed. Oftentimes, this kind of like job is outsourced or kind of like absorbed by design systems designers or product designers, and they do a really great job most of the time, but it's kind of like, you know, a side project. It's never like somebody really responsible for it. So you would ask yourself, like, why did Spotify actually invest in hiring someone with such a super specific skill set? And I think it's this. So I added a little footnote to my question with bad grammar. I think the greatest challenge for a typographer in design systems is to find out how can we make our typography sound good for everyone. So for Spotify, it's not just like, you know, does it generally look great? It's more about like, how do we make it great for everyone? And what I mean by that is like, how do we make our typography not just expressive, but also accessible and culturally relevant? And that's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to start with the last point, which is a big one. Spotify is currently available in 192 markets. That means that we localize our product in 74 languages. We support 36 languages with our own custom font, Spotify Mix, and 17 languages with the modified version of Circular, which is the font that we used before as well. And then for the rest of the languages, we fall back to system fonts. Got a quick look at the typefaces, so you know what I'm talking about. This is Spotify Mix. So obviously it's a custom font. We designed it really carefully with a lot of thought behind it, a lot of heart in it, actually. And the idea was to reflect the vibrancy and the creativity of Spotify's community in a font that works well for branding, but also for product. So this has the tone of voice that we envisioned for Spotify. It's relatively unique. And before that, we used Circular a lot as our primary font. Circular has a very similar tone of voice. Like if I showed this slide to my dad, he would go just like, it's the same font, what are you talking about? But you know, the devil is in the details. It has a similar tone of voice. The design is really quite different once you start really looking at it. Now, the advantage of having either a custom font or a modified font is that you have the ability to fine control typographic features. What I mean by that is that you are able to, for example, input into things like letter spacing, like how much space does each letter occupy, how airy is the text, or how dense is the text. You can also input into line heights, which is really quite important for readability, and yeah, also for typographic hierarchies, I suppose. Those kind of metrics for line heights or letter spacing are baked into the fonts. So if we go back thinking about the 74 languages that the Spotify app is localized in, you ask yourself, how do you actually define a line height that works for all of those different languages? And Encore's answer to that is that you don't. Different scripts have different typographic needs. So here we have, for example, on the left-hand side is Devanagari, the Devanagari script in Hindi, and on the right-hand side is Arabic. And both of them have a very, very different structure to what we are used to in Europe, for example. If you compare it to Latin or Cyrillic or Greek, it runs a lot taller. So it needs more vertical space, or letters get clipped, or they clash with each other, like in the example I circled. So if our goal is to achieve the same level of readability in languages of all scripts, then we need to respect these kind of like different requirements for line heights. We think it would be really disrespectful to users of the app around the world if we try to force every script into the same parameters. So instead, at Spotify, we use subsets. And for each script subset, we defined individual vertical dimensions. So we really went in, we did a lot of testing. We go to just like how high does it go? How often does it go high? Because we don't want it to be too airy either. You want to have like a reading flow. So we did a lot of research into like how big, or like how big does the line height have to be in order to avoid clashing or clipping. And we did that for all of those subsets. Some of them are actually quite similar, so they share the same metrics because the heights are comparable, but Arabic and Devanagari, the examples from the previous slide, they need more space. So we needed to have a larger line height for them. And we served them through text styles in a way where we use those intrinsic metrics and let them define how much or how little vertical space each script takes up. That means that we actually use defaults and we discourage overriding line heights and letter spacing values. So our line height is always going to be auto, our letter spacing will always going to be 0%. This approach works really well, especially well for the 53 languages that are supported by either Spotify Mix or Circular. But that leaves us with 21 languages in 14 different scripts, I think, for which we don't really have custom or modified fonts and where we have to fall back to system fonts for. For a number of reasons, Encore can't host fonts to support all of the scripts. So as I said, we let them fall back onto system fonts. So here you have our font stack, and you can see it first tries to render everything Spotify Mix. If the character is not available in the font, it falls back to the circular subsets, and finally, it uses a sans serif system font as fallback. Which brings me back to my initial question. Does it actually sound good for everyone? And I don't think it can sound the same for all languages, but for the majority of languages, 53 out of 74, we managed to handpick fonts and we managed to come up with a really refined approach to typography. For the remaining 21 languages, the choice is largely up to the operating systems. So the Spotify app is available on iPhones, on Android phones, on iPads, tablets, on desktop and web player. It's available on TVs, wearables, even in the car. So some of those languages will render differently on each one of those devices, unfortunately. The kind of light at the end of the tunnel is that most of those system fonts that they fall back to actually have the same approach to setting vertical metrics and to letter spacing as we have established for ourselves in our design system. That means that we unfortunately don't have the same fine control as we have for languages that are covered by Spotify Mix or Circular, but we at least established that like letters will not clash and they will not collide. And that is really good because a lot of those languages do see the letters clash quite regularly. Right, change of topic. I was wondering if I had the same purple, but not quite. So I brushed past this a little bit when I had the slide up. I said for a number of reasons, Encore can't host the custom fonts to support all languages. And I want to talk a little bit about the number one reason, which is obviously the need to keep the app lightweight. So before I do that, a quick detour, because some of you eagle-eyed designers might have seen that in the slide with the font stacks, we have actually 2 different cuts of our Latin font. So we're going to have a quick look at why that is. We have one cut that is designed specifically for titles and headlines, and another one that is for body copy and marginal text. So for larger text size, our emphasis is on expression, and I explain later what that means. For smaller sizes, we have a focus on readability. The differences lie, again, in our good friends, letter spacing and line height, which means that for text to be easily read at small sizes, you will want to insert a little bit more white space between them. So on the bottom, you can see the font that is used for smaller text, and you can see the space between the letters is a little bit bigger because we allow a little bit extra space on both sides of the actual vector. And then line height adjustments kind of follow the same logic. For headlines and titles, we keep things tight. We kind of allow enough space so that accented letters don't clash. But other than that, it's quite compact still. For smaller text, we increase the line height a little bit more, which makes the reading even more comfortable at smaller sizes. If you look at this and you think, well, has that lady not heard of variable fonts? I did. Well, you might be quite right in thinking that. We thought that too in the beginning. Quick detour within the detour to talk about variable fonts. So variable fonts were introduced in 2016 as an extension to the OpenType spec. If you don't know what the OpenType spec is, don't ever learn about it. It doesn't, you don't need to know that. The variable fonts kind of allow you to store information about an entire font family within one font file, which is a game changer for both designers, type designers, and users. So for type designers, you don't have to draw every character for all of those 45 or whatever fonts on the left-hand side. Instead, you draw a few instances on the extremes, and then you interpolate between them. And for users, it means that you can now load one font file, but still get access to the entire design space. Okay. So when variable fonts were introduced, 5 axes were defined in the spec. We have weight and width, which are the ones that you also saw in the previous slides. They're kind of self-explanatory. One is going from very light to very dark, and width is going from very narrow to very wide. And then we have slant and italic, which kind of do the same thing, but one of them is continuous, so you can change the angle of the slant. And with the other one, italic is binary, so you can either have uprights or italics, but nothing in between. And then there's this curious one on the bottom, which is the optical size axis. And that one is meant to optimize for use at specific sizes, which sounds exactly like the kind of thing that I was looking for when I was talking about how we have to have different line heights for different sizes. So that would be, the obvious solution for combining our 2 assets into one. Well, unfortunately, that's not possible. On the right-hand side, you can see an excerpt of the table where some of this information is stored in, and this table can't be buried, unfortunately. We also can't store multiple sets of vertical metrics within a font file, so that's a no-go, and we have to conclude that we can't use a single variable font to handle different line height needs for different fonts. So obviously we thought about why don't we combine it anyway, and then instead of using auto, line height, and 0% for letter spacing, we just have the title and headline styles with overwritten metrics over there. And this thought didn't go very well. We just quickly discovered that if we did this, we would compromise all of the languages that are currently not supported by Spotify Mix, And that would be a shame because we would introduce clashing and clipping again. That's just not a trade-off that we were willing to make. So I'm going to circle back to the main reason why hosting fonts for all languages isn't feasible, which was the file size. So thinking back about, Spotify Mix and circular subsets that Encore hosts, like this kind of level of typographic finesse does really come at a cost. So we just learned we have 2 cards for Latin in Spotify Mix, and then we have circular to render Arabic, Cyrillic, Devanagari, Greek, and Hebrew. We have to make all of those available in 3 different file formats. We have TTF that is needed for Android and iOS. We have WAV that is still needed for TV. And we have WAV2 for most of the other platforms. If you're not familiar with font format files, then just also don't worry about that one. WAV and WAV2 are compressed TTFs. WAV2 is more efficient in the compression than WAV is, so WAV2 is the smallest in file size. TTF by far the biggest one. So in an ideal world, we would want to use WAV2 everywhere, but that's unfortunately not possible. If we add all of that up, we end up with 4.7 megabytes that we are currently hosting in just fonts. And if we were to extend this approach to all of the 74 languages, that would mean that the total file size is just out of this world and completely unsustainable to host for us. So that's the reason why we only have these limited set of languages. But why do we actually care so much about keeping the file size low? That's because we're going back to this one. We want to make Spotify available to everyone. And unfortunately, every additional font size increases the app size. And that might not be an issue for users on the latest phones and with fast internet, but it is a concern for users with less performant devices and those in regions with limited connectivity. And I can't share internal data about this, but we know that a larger app size negatively impacts download rates, which sounds like a business concern. So you go just why does this typographer care about it? But it's not just a business concern. It's a personal one for me. I do want to make Spotify to be accessible to as many people as possible, regardless of their device and internet speed. So it's a bit of a, I don't know, just need to weigh up. Do we want really lovely, fine control typography, or do we want this typography to even end up on phones in the hands of users? And talking about accessibility, obviously we also want everyone, regardless of their abilities, to navigate, understand, and use our UI successfully. And that includes people with low vision, with blindness, with hearing impairments, with cognitive impairments, with motor impairments, and also with situational disabilities. Now I'm hired to worry about how people consume written content, so I'm going to focus mainly on people with low vision in the next part. So what follows are a few examples of common vision disorders to enable us to put ourselves in the shoes of someone with low vision. This first one simulates macular degeneration, which affects the part of the eye that is responsible for sharp and detailed central vision. It can cause blurring and darkness in the center of the visual field, and it can also affect the ability to see fine detail. This is particularly common in older people. And this is a simulation of glaucoma, which is a group of eye conditions in which the nerve at the back of the eye is damaged. This is usually gradual and progressive and is often not detected in the early stages. This is a simulation of diabetic retinopathy, which is caused by complications of diabetes. The effects often vary, but oftentimes they include blurred and patchy vision and floating spots in the visual field, and this can lead to blindness if not properly managed as well. And this image simulates a group of inherited disorders called retinitis pigmentosa. Oh, by the way, I'm not an ophthalmologist, so if I mispronounce any of this, don't catch me out. Retinitis pigmentosa, gradual vision loss as well. The most common first symptom is difficulty seeing in poor light, and then usually it's followed by a loss of peripheral vision. And then we have this one, which is visual acuity loss. So visual acuity commonly refers to the clarity of vision, but it's actually technically someone's ability to recognize small details with precision. It's dependent on optical and neural factors, for example, the sharpness of the retinal image within the eye, the health and the functioning of the retina itself, and the sensitivity of the parts of the brain that actually process what we see. Globally, more than 250 million people live with visual acuity loss or blindness. So that's a big group. And obviously, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this will get even worse as we age. We will be at increasingly higher risk of eye disorders as we get older. This is me. I'm in my early 40s, and I'm already squinting my way through life. My vision is blurred, so I try to make this slide in a way that I would see it without glasses. So I have blurred vision, which is not really like this kind of blurring. It's kind of like, I don't know, like repeated images layered on top of each other, and then a little bit of a slight offset everywhere. So it's not very nice to read things like this. And then I have floating spots, which I've had for like most of my adulthood, I think. I luckily forget about those most of the time. Unless I look at like something really bright, and I love playing squash, so I spend a lot of time in well-lit white rooms, and I can tell you those floaters get really annoying. But yeah, for me, people like me and the millions of others that have like more or less severe low vision, it really makes a huge difference if people put a little bit of thought into their UIs. At Spotify, we are super, super fortunate that we have a dedicated accessibility team, and it's part of Encore. So we are like relatively close with them. And this collaboration allows us to integrate like state-of-the-art accessibility features directly into our design system, which is great. I want to briefly talk about two of those as they relate to typography, and then I want to talk a little bit more about the font itself. So the first accessibility feature that is baked right into the design system is accessible color themes. So Encore provides color themes with legal requirements for color contrast baked right into how we name and how we organize our colors. And obviously, we strongly discourage mixing color sets in design specs because misusing them can introduce accessibility issues and it can cause unexpected problems later down the line. And then the second accessibility feature that is directly integrated into our design system is dynamic type on iOS. So dynamic type, if you don't know it, adjusts the text size based on user preferences. So this is really good for people with reduced vision, but it's also really good for people that either want to see more or less content, so they can kind of like make their decision there themselves. It also seems to be really useful for people who want to glance at their phone while driving. So I'm not saying like open the Spotify app. I'm talking about like, you know, cab drivers. And then since we had the chance to design a Spotify mix from scratch, we were able to make decisions that enhance legibility and readability right from the beginning. So legibility refers to how easily you can recognize letter forms, and readability refers to how comfortably you can read a paragraph of text. And as you know already, because I talked about it twice, we already adjusted letter spacing and line height to improve readability at smaller sizes. But we also incorporated 3 different type genres into Spotify Mix, which is supposed to assist with legibility. So we have some letters that are distinctly humanist. Is Elliot here yet, or is he coming tomorrow? Okay, so Elliot, I expect you to know all of this. I don't expect anyone else to know the differences between the type genres. But humanist typefaces have this feature where like all the apertures are really wide open. So if you look at the C, for example, the white space that is, right, how do you see it? This white space, wait, actually, this one is quite wide. It could be like a lot more closed. And if it's more closed, it would be a grotesque typeface. So if you look at the G, for example, like this aperture is a lot more closed. So we have distinctly grotesque letters as well in there. And then we have geometric letters, which are very similar to what we used to have in circular. So we know from legibility and readability research that letters that look alike are more difficult to, let me phrase it the other way around. The less letters look alike, the easier they are to recognize. And the less people need to interrupt their reading flow to decipher individual letters. So that's why we combined those three type genres in Spotify Mix. The idea is that we have different anatomical features and that make the letters more distinct and more difficult to confuse. So I have a couple of examples for that. This is the uppercase letter S, which is humanist, open, and the number 5, which is grotesque, closed. Those are harder to confuse in Spotify Mix than if they were to belong to the same type genre, because they would have the same kind of like opening. We also intentionally avoided a geometric number 0 because they tend to be difficult to distinguish from an uppercase letter O that is from the same type genre. And then we have those three. So they're a bit of a special case because they actually don't look anything alike if you look at them. But they get confused by people with low vision a lot. And that's because they all have a middle segment. So in the E, for example, that will be the horizontal bar that you can see. In the S, that's the diagonal spine. So those three letters are really unique in our Latin alphabet as lowercase letters because they are more dense than others because of this middle segment, which means that if you already have like blurred vision or anything, so if I take my glasses off, like these will be more difficult to decipher for me just because they have the same kind of density in there and are standing out from all the other letters in the alphabet. We could have opted for a single story A. So a single story A is the one where you don't have the middle segment. It's kind of like how you write it, an O with a vertical bar on the end. But because it already looks like an O with a vertical bar on the end, it actually gets confused with a lowercase letter O more often than an A would be confused with an S. So we stayed away from that. Yeah, so we know that expert readers with perfect vision can confuse those characters very easily. So we wanted to put an extra effort into designing them to be as clear and as distinct as possible. And that's how we ended up with those like three genres and a literal mix of type genres, which, you know, hence the name Spotify Mix. And yeah, I think I'm going to wrap up with this. Did I talk fast? I'm okay? Okay. I think we can all agree that typography is a little bit of a beast in the context of a design system. So we need to consider things like language localization. We need to consider all of the devices and operating systems that you're targeting. We sometimes need to balance typographic finesse versus performance. And sometimes we need to ensure accessibility for everyone. Well, we always should do that. We want to ensure accessibility for everyone. And I haven't even touched on like all of the other Spotify-owned products that are using Encore that are not the app. So it kind of like, it is this times 5 on top of that. So with all of that in mind, the big question is like, does it sound good for everyone? And I really, really think that we laid a really strong foundation for making Spotify's typography sound good. I know the Encore team around me is super, super dedicated to getting things right. So we would obviously keep improving our design system to make our UI more enjoyable for even more users in the future. And I think I will leave it with that. Is that okay? Right, okay. I hope this was a useful deep dive into typography. I know it was a change of pace. Find me if you want to chat more. I'll be here today and tomorrow. And thank you very much.
Bianca Berning.